Hello and welcome back to Fluttering Butterflies. My name is Michelle, and actually today I just wanted to do a really quick video rounding up some of the poetry I've been reading lately because I'm returning all 5 of these books to the library today. So I thought I'd get that out of the way first, and I did want to talk more about poetry on this channel. I hope you don't mind. So lately I've been reading a lot of poetry, mostly poems here and there on websites like Poem Hunter. I'd just click on a random theme or a random poem or poet and read some things here or there, but I was finding that it was quite unreliable doing that. I really wanted to read more of a collection to see how one poem flows to another. So I did read 2 collections of poetry previous to the books that I'll be talking about today, but I'm going to wrap those up in a different video because these ones are a little bit more time sensitive right now. Because I wanted to read more of a collection of poetry, I did go to the library to see what kind of selection they had, and I have to say the poetry selection at my local library is the saddest, smallest little section in the world. But I did come across 5 books that looked interesting. The first book that I read is this book. It's called Poetry Please, and it's love poems that I guess were collated by the Radio 4 channel. And all of these poems in this collection are love poems. And I think what I wanted from this anthology of poetry is probably some reason. Like I wanted something to tell me, did readers call up and suggest these things? Did somebody else choose them? I don't really know what the selection process here. I don't listen to Radio 4. I have no idea what the Poetry Please selection is like. I did enjoy this series. I did enjoy this collection of poetry. I found it interesting, the wide definition of love presented in the poetry. Not all of it felt like it was romantic poetry. Some of it seemed like they were poems about entirely different topics, and then just right at the end there'd be like a slight curveball and it would be something a little bit about love. So I liked how it wasn't all passionate romantic love in the sense that I was thinking of, that there were a lot more layers of gentleness and subtlety to this, but I also did want some more emotion as well. It was pretty quick to read through these, and I think that what I've been finding reading collections like this is that I mostly enjoy modern poetry that doesn't rhyme, and I don't really like a classic sort of poem. There's quite a lot of classic love poetry in here, like Keats and Donne, and they're not my favorite. Next up I picked up the only other collection or sort of anthology, and that is this one. It's Essential Poems from the Staying Alive Trilogy, and this one is edited by Neil Astley. The Staying Alive Trilogy is this 3 sets of books with 500 poems in each of them, so that's 1,500 poems, and the editor of these 3 books, Neil Astley, has collated what he considers the most essential 100 poems, the 1,500 poems in total, and that's he did write a little introduction at the beginning, talking a little bit about some of the feedback that he's gotten from the trilogy, the poems and themes that a lot of people responded to in this trilogy of books. And the books are Staying Alive, Being Alive, and Being Human. I did have the first book in that trilogy, and I'm really, after reading this, and after reading this smaller edition of the poetry there, I think I really want to pick up all three of these poetry collections, because I did love reading this book a lot. The reason that I did pick it up is because the first poem in the book is one of my favorites, and that's Wild Geese by Mary Oliver, which I just love. There's a lot more modern poetry in this collection. I think all of the poetry in the whole trilogy of poetry collections is modern poetry. It really covers a wide range of topics as well, that I found incredibly fascinating and moving. The next three poetry collections that I'll be talking about today are by individual poets. The first one that I picked up is The Bees by Carol Ann Duffy, and I only picked this one up because it says on the front cover it was winner of the Costa Prize for Poetry 2011, and also that she was poet laureate at the time. I'm not really familiar with Carol Ann Duffy. I know that she is a well-respected poet, and when I mentioned in my book club that I was reading poetry, Carol Ann Duffy's name was mentioned as a recommendation. I think that while I didn't love this collection, I could definitely see through these poems that Carol Ann Duffy is a beautiful writer, and there's certain phrases or couplets, I guess, of writing of hers that really moved me. Though none of the actual poems themselves stood out as being favorites of mine, her language does come across as really, really beautiful. So I think that after reading this collection, I'll definitely be picking up more by Carol Ann Duffy. Next up, I picked up Ariel by Sylvia Plath. I read The Bell Jar as a teenager and I absolutely loved it. And since the age of about 16, I've said to myself I really should pick up more by Sylvia Plath, her poetry. I hear her journals and drawings are quite good. I've never done that before this, and when I saw this collection in particular, library shelves, I was quite excited, and it didn't disappoint. This collection of poetry was very, very emotional. There's I believe this is the collection of poetry that she wrote just before she committed suicide. So there are poems in this collection that felt very, very sad. Like her despair is very evident in her language and in her poetry. I think she's incredible though, and I will definitely be picking up more by her. It was nice to read some of the poetry that I had already been familiar with from Sylvia Plath, like Daddy. And while none of the poems spring to mind so long after reading it as being favorites from this book, it was just the wealth of emotion from her poetry that I found amazing. The fifth and final book that I wanted to talk to you about today is a collection of poetry by E. Cummings. This is a collection called 22 and 50 Poems. It's just a mashup of these two collections of stories, 22 poems first and then 50 poems. There's no real reason to have these two together. To say I was really looking forward to reading this collection of poetry by E. Cummings. He is a poet that I'd heard a great deal about. The only poem that I knew of his before reading this collection is I Carry Your Heart, which is definitely one of my favourite poems. And I started reading this book and I honestly didn't think that I'd make it through. It's quite a slim book, you can see. There's only 72 poems in it, but I almost couldn't do it because I just don't get E. Cummings. I mean, a lot of his poems, the first one that I read in this collection, I don't know if you can see it, and this is how it kind of goes. There's a lot of fragments of words here, and I just didn't get it. I think that if I read it more closely, maybe if I was looking at it in a more critical perspective, maybe I would appreciate his work more than I did. But reading it just from the point of view of somebody who wants to be entertained for a little while, a lot of E. Cummings poetry just flew over my head, I'm afraid. I just don't get him. I don't. I have to say some of his poems that appear in actual verse, in which there are full words and fragments of sentences that make sense together, were captivating, but on the whole, not my favorite at all. I probably will be giving E. Cummings' work more of a wider berth from now on. That's it for me today. My quick wrap up of some of the poetry books that I've been reading. Based on what I've just said, do you have any recommendations for other collections that that I should pick up? I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your poetry recommendations. I really would. So that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.